Every holiday shopper's got a list, but Ross shoppers, you've got a mission. Like a gift run that turns into a disco snow globe, throw pillows, and PJs for the whole family, dog included. At Ross, holiday magic isn't about spending more, it's about giving more for less. Ross, work your magic.
This message comes from Capital One. With the Spark Cash Plus card from Capital One, you earn unlimited 2% cash back on every purchase and get big purchasing power so your business can spend more and earn more. Stephen, Brandon, and Bruno, the business owners of SandCloud, reinvested their 2% cash back to help build the company's retail presence. Capital One, what's in your wallet? Find out more at CapitalOne.com/SparkCashPlus. Terms apply.
In the early decades of American independence, there was a belief that the fledgling nation contained within its boundaries the entire history of humanity. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, perhaps I should let President Thomas Jefferson explain. In the early 1800s, the president romantically opined that a journey across the continent, quote, is the equivalent to a survey in time of the progress of man from the infancy of creation to the present day, end quote. Like many 19th century thinkers, Jefferson believed that all human societies progressed through the same phases of development. First, there was the hunting and gathering phase, where human beings were only slightly more developed than the animals that they killed for subsistence. Next came the pastoral society, where animals were roughly domesticated into herds that could be tended by shepherds. Then there was the agricultural society, defined by its permanent settlements, well-tended fields, fenced-in allotments, and thoroughly domesticated livestock. Then finally came the commercial society, defined by elaborate systems of exchange, industry, technology, and a sophisticated division of labor. Thomas Jefferson believed that in the early 1800s, each of these stages could be witnessed firsthand in America. According to the president, a timeline of human development was laid out over the country from west to east. A traveler moving from the Rocky Mountains towards the Atlantic Ocean would first encounter indigenous hunters with, quote, no law but that of nature, end quote. As one moved east, the traveler would then come across groups, quote, in a pastoral state, raising domestic animals to supply the defects of hunting, end quote. Then as this traveler headed steadily towards the coast, he would encounter, quote, semi-barbarous citizens of the United States, end quote, followed by, quote, gradual shades of improving man until he reached his most improved state in our seaport towns, end quote. The people of the East, in Jefferson's estimation, were simply existing at a higher level of civilization than both the indigenous people of the West and the semi-barbarous settlers who were pushing in to that traditional indigenous territory. But this state of affairs, with all those societal models coexisting, was believed to be especially unique because it was destined to be short-lived. This theory of human progress dictated that things simply must keep progressing. Civilization would undoubtedly overcome barbarism. The American West would one day be little different from the eastern United States. This inevitability was viewed as bittersweet. On the one hand, this transformation represented American ingenuity, sacrifice, and the human triumph over nature. On the other hand, there was a persistent feeling like something was being lost. Unique cultures, be they the traditions of the first people of the plain or the early settlers' ways of life, were soon going to vanish. They would be outmoded and slowly killed by the rolling tide of Euro-American commercial society that moved from the East to the West. Many Americans wondered how exactly they should feel about all of this. This was the emotional tension that made Buffalo Bill's Wild West show such a crowd-pleasing phenomenon. Buffalo Bill crafted his own mythical biography so that it roughly aligned with these ideas about the progress of civilization. He started in the far west as a wild and scrounging teenage gold prospector. He then literally became one of the links in the chain of America's westward progress when he became a young Pony Express rider. He then became a hunter, but he was so effective and prolific that he transformed the hunt. Bill claimed that he shot thousands of buffalo by herding the supposedly unherdable animals. A hunter so good that he becomes something like a shepherd. Then he became an army scout, a quote-unquote semi-barbarous frontier savant who bridged the gap between professional soldiers and their indigenous adversaries. Then he finally went east and became a performer, an entrepreneur, and an urban tastemaker. His progress was the progress of civilization. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which originally started performances in 1883, was similarly steeped in ideas about what was lost and gained by the supposed inevitability of American progress. This massive outdoor exhibition simultaneously celebrated how the West was won, while romantically mourning a way of life that was supposedly passing away. When the show first came indoors to Madison Square Garden in 1886, the show was organized using the supposed epochs of Western development, with acts set in the primeval forest, the pastoral plain, the cattle ranch, and the mining camp, respectively. Wild nature gave way to human industry. Buffalo Bill spent his whole life chasing a certain middle-class respectability. As such, he wanted the Wild West show to be something more than just a Western-themed circus. In the late 19th century, the circus, despite being quite popular, was seen as shady, disreputable, and base. The big top trafficked in cheap thrills and human oddities. As such, it was snubbed as an immoral haven for con men. The Wild West show needed to be a circus with none of the negative circus baggage. So it was promoted as an educational exhibition of Western history and culture. The promoters didn't even like using the word show to describe the Wild West. They didn't want the audience to think that what they were seeing was merely a performance. This was an authentic depiction of frontier life. This was history made flesh. The story told by the Wild West show, therefore, had a profound impact on how people came to understand American history. The millions of people who took in the Wild West over its 30-year run were presented a tale about the development of human society. They were told stories about America's first people that cast them as the sometimes admirable but ultimately doomed adversaries of Western progress. The Lakota and the Pawnee performers were the villains of the Wild West, while Buffalo Bill and his Anglo-Saxon cowboys were the unfailing heroes. Circus-like feats of horsemanship and gunplay punctuated melodramatic renderings of stagecoach attacks, settlers' homes besieged by angry Lakota, and grand depictions of battles from the Black Hills War, including George Custer's death at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But the titillating violence was tempered by the conceit that all of this was educational. This was history. On top of that, the show was documenting something that was evaporating from the real American West. The indigenous warriors were presented as something like endangered animals that once thrived in the wild, but now could only be seen in the arena. By the same token, it was also suggested that these semi-barbarous cowboys were also destined to fade away. But everything that was presented in Buffalo Bill's Wild West was a carefully constructed illusion. The scenes from the American West that he touted as authentic reenactments were mostly fictional. Those that were based on real events were massively exaggerated, contorted, or changed to better suit the dramatic needs of the show. The Wild West worked because it reinforced a story about American history that was already well known to the audience. This performance did not challenge the audience's expectations, but rather played to them. So, was there anything real about Buffalo Bill's Wild West? Did this exhibition ever manage to live up to its promise to edify and educate? Was the Wild West able to capture something unique and ineffable about the 19th century frontier? Or is this patient zero for all the cowboy-themed fake history that has come in its wake? Let's see what we can figure out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 241, Who Invented the Wild West, Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone that you can hear this show ad-free through Patreon. Just head to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and start supporting at $5 or more to get access to an ad-free feed and a ton of extra episodes. Speaking of extras, I'm now pleased to announce that the next extra episode of Our Fake History will be on the 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. Yes, it came from behind to win the day. The 7 Wonders beat out the Viking presence in North America, which got out to an early lead. But when all the votes were counted, exactly 2% more of the patron voters decided that they would rather hear a show about the ancient wonders. Hey, that's democracy, folks. Now I will begin the long process of researching, writing, and recording this extra episode. As longtime listeners know, this usually takes me a few months. So, as always, I appreciate your patience while I put this together for you. I've never failed to deliver an extra, but it does take some time. I will keep you posted on my progress. Now, if you would like to hear this new extra episode when it is released and all the previous patrons-only extras, then please head to Patreon and find a level of support that works for you. This week, we are returning to the late 19th century to examine the life and legacy of Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West show. This is part 2 in a 2-part series. So if you've not heard part 1 yet, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give that a listen now. In that first part, we introduced William Cody, the Western hustler who reinvented himself as Buffalo Bill sometime in the late 1860s. As you heard, trying to get an accurate sense of William Cody's early life is challenging because Bill was such a prolific liar and mythmaker. By the 1870s, Bill was working as an actor and theater company owner who made a living portraying himself on stage. Since his biography needed to reflect his on-stage persona, it was manipulated to do just that. While it was true that Bill lost his father at the age of 11 and was forced to start working at a young age, many of his youthful adventures making a living on the frontier are highly suspect. For instance, Bill claimed to have been the youngest ever Pony Express rider and the holder of the record for the longest continuous ride in the company's history. Both of those claims are highly dubious. There is no evidence that Bill ever even worked for the short-lived Pony Express. Bill would eventually reinvent himself as a buffalo hunter for the Kansas Pacific Railway. However, the famous story of him winning his nickname in a buffalo hunting competition is almost certainly fictional. When he eventually found his way into scouting for the United States Army, Bill started presenting himself as an exaggerated, almost comic book version of a frontier guide. He leaned into the character type known as the quote-unquote white Indian. That is someone of European heritage who supposedly has the tracking acumen and keen instincts stereotypically associated with indigenous people. Now, it is true that Bill fought at a handful of important battles in the wars with the first people of the plain, but he notoriously exaggerated his exploits. For instance, he likely did not kill the celebrated Cheyenne leader Tall Bull at the Battle of Summit Springs. As you heard, the real turning point in Bill's life came in 1869 when he met the hack writer and controversy-plagued theater promoter Ned Buntline. Buntline appreciated Buffalo Bill's colorful presentation and made him into the hero of his dime store novel, Buffalo Bill, King of the Bordermen. The novel was a hit, and Buffalo Bill became a household name. This paved the way for Bill's entrance into show business. In 1872, he started starring as himself in on-stage adaptations of his fictional adventures. We finished off last week by examining the strange way that Bill's on-stage persona started affecting his real-life behavior. As you heard, when Bill returned to scouting in the late 1870s, he started seeking out exploits that would make for good theater. This led to his infamous encounter with the Cheyenne leader Yellow Hair at Warbonnet Creek. What was by most accounts a quick, almost accidental gunfight was turned into a chivalrous duel in Cody's retelling. However, in Cody's quest for glory and trophies attesting to his frontier bona fides, he made the gruesome choice to scalp the Cheyenne leader and steal his war bonnet and other belongings. Proclaiming the prize to be the, quote, first scalp for Custer, Bill went on to present himself as the first avenger of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who had died a month before at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Cody's fictionalized version of the fight was then turned into the play called The Red Right Hand, or The First Scalp for Custer, that toured the eastern United States for almost 2 years. One thing that was consistent about all of Buffalo Bill's self-aggrandizing legends was his knack for absorbing various Western myths into his personal myth. You might remember that I compared him to the Blob, the giant gelatinous monster that grows as it consumes whatever is placed in front of it. Well, Buffalo Blob was very much the same. Western icons like the Pony Express, George Custer, Tall Bull, and the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers were all absorbed into the growing Buffalo Bill persona. America first got to know this persona through dime store novels and the crude stage plays in which Buffalo Bill starred. But the unique character of Buffalo Bill found its greatest expression as the ringmaster, narrator, and hero of the Wild West show. In today's episode, I really want to break down the Wild West show as a piece of history-themed entertainment. You see, Buffalo Bill was not shy when promoting the Wild West as an authentic exposition of real frontier culture and American history. As such, the narratives that animated the show were presented as truths. While some of the more skeptical contemporary critics remained suspicious of Buffalo Bill's personal exploits, very few seemed to question the historical accuracy of the show at large. The Wild West presented American audiences with an exciting but ultimately comforting story about the conquest of the frontier. When the show started touring the United Kingdom and continental Europe, it was greeted enthusiastically as the first product of American culture worth the attention of European audiences. In this way, Buffalo Bill's Wild West did much to shape the international perception of American history in the late 19th century. So let's get into it. What was the Wild West show, and what story did it tell about America? Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Indeed. Hiring isn't just about finding someone who will take the job. You need the right person with the right background who can move your business forward. If I wanted candidates who match what I'm looking for, I'd trust Indeed-sponsored jobs. Recently, I had to hire someone to help me create the videos that I've been doing for this show. To be honest, it can be hard to find someone who has exactly the right skills that you need and gets your style. Well, with Indeed, you can be incredibly specific in your job postings to make sure you get the people that actually know what they're doing and will actually be a good fit for your organization. That's what makes the difference. You get people who you are actually looking for. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results now with Indeed-sponsored jobs. And listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory. Just go to Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/OurFakeHistory. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. So, about a year ago, I decided that I was going to try and get a bit healthier. I started being a bit more conscious about my diet. I started exercising more. And you know what? It started to work. I'm feeling pretty good these days. In my quest to get more vitamins and minerals into my diet, I gave AG1 a try. And I have to say, I enjoy it. AG1 has 5 probiotic strains and more than 75 vitamins and minerals in each serving. And what I appreciate about AG1 is they actually seem to test their product. In an industry where not everyone invests heavily in research, they go to great lengths to continually invest in rigorous, peer-reviewed clinical trials. I also appreciate that AG1 actually tastes good. They got a bunch of new delicious flavors, including tropical, berry, and citrus, in addition to the original. So if you want to try it, head to drinkag1.com/fake and get a free welcome kit, including a bottle of vitamin D and free AG1 travel packs when you first subscribe. That's drinkag1.com/fake. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Homes.com. If you've ever been in the market for a new home, you know home shopping can be a lot. There's so much you don't know and so much you need to know. What are the neighborhoods like? What are the schools like? Who's the agent who knows the listing or neighborhood best? And why can't all this information just be in one place? Well, now it is on Homes.com. They've got everything you need to know about the listing itself, but even better, they've got comprehensive neighborhood guides and detailed reports about local schools. And their agent directory helps you see the agent's current listings and sales history. Homes.com collaboration tools make it easier than ever to share all this information with your family. It's a whole cul-de-sac of home shopping information all at your fingertips. Homes.com. We've done your homework. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was an evolution of his increasingly elaborate 1870s theater productions. As I mentioned in part 1, the plays starring Buffalo Bill relied on a certain amount of gimmickry. At first, the gimmick was that a real frontier scout was going to portray himself on stage. The blurring of reality and theater illusion was part of the shtick. Now, the fact that Bill was not an especially good actor was initially part of the draw. But after a few years, this gimmick was starting to wear thin. Bill was becoming a more competent actor, which, ironically, hurt the supposed authenticity that he brought to the stage. So he started searching for new ways to make his show feel real. One of the ways that he started spicing up his productions was by bringing real animals on stage. Many of his shows started featuring real horses. Some shows would have live bison and others elk. The real animals brought a sense of excitement to the productions, even though the constraints of the stage meant that the beasts couldn't really move around. In this period, Bill also started incorporating more indigenous performers into his shows. In the early days, most of the so-called stage Indians in the show were portrayed by white actors in a type of brownface. But as the show evolved, Bill started employing Pawnee and Lakota performers to fill these roles. Having real Lakota people in a play was perceived as a marker of authenticity. Bill's shows were part of a larger trend in American entertainment in the 1880s that saw more indigenous people seeking out careers in show business. The end of the Black Hills War in 1877 marked the end of a significant chapter in armed indigenous resistance to American expansion in the West. Many of the nations that had fought the most tenaciously against the incursions of American settlers had been forced to accept treaties that placed them on reservations. In time, even those reservation lands were steadily diminished by a government who kept changing the terms of the deal. But ironically, the end of the Black Hills War coincided with a new interest in indigenous cultures among Eastern Anglo-Americans. It's been noted that as soon as Native people no longer seemed like a threat, there was room for a romantic nostalgia to grow around these so-called vanishing Americans. As the scholar L.G. Moses has pointed out, the myth that indigenous people were somehow fading away from the Western landscape was key to their allure as performers in the late 19th century. Moses writes, quote, "A belief that they were the vanishing Americans doomed to extinction by the march of civilization became the most romantic of all impressions associated with Indians. The image of a doomed and dying race produced in the romantic mind melancholy and pity." End quote. In the 1880s, there was a growing belief that the supposed vanishing of America's first people was almost complete. As such, indigenous performers were treated like rare specimens. People who were willing to perform traditional dances, demonstrate feats of bareback horsemanship, and even create facsimiles of sacred rituals discovered that Euro-Americans had become eager audiences. However, there was a specific type of, quote, Indianness that Eastern audiences seemed particularly enthusiastic about. People wanted to see representations of the people of the plain, the horseback warriors who fought Custer at Little Bighorn. Buffalo Bill's theater shows had been revived by the inclusion of indigenous performers, but he sensed that he was not fully exploiting their appeal. Buffalo Bill biographer Lewis Warren explains that, quote, "As Indians became essential to the spectacle of Buffalo Bill, the need to expand the performance space from the stage to the arena became increasingly evident. For Indianness to be on display, Indians needed to be on horses." End quote. In this way, the creation of the Wild West show was deeply tied to a new group of stereotypes about North America's first people. The quote-unquote show Indian was someone who rode a horse, lived in a teepee, and wore feathered headdresses. This was a show business reflection of a few very specific cultures from the Great Plains, namely the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Pawnee. Very rarely were distinctions made between people from different language or cultural groups. These performers were all reductively grouped together as quote-unquote Indians. This helped reinforce the perception that all indigenous cultures were alike. They all must involve horses, teepees, and feathered headdresses, because that's what we saw in the Wild West show. The most entertaining and narratively useful facets of plain life were emphasized in that show. Depending on the act, the indigenous characters were either presented as violent wild men or noble savages, the two stereotypes that by the 1880s had been part of the discourse around Native people for centuries. However, we should not forget that the performers in these shows were individuals with their own agency. Their feelings about these performances were often complex, and that is something I want to return to a little later. But for now, suffice it to say that the exhibition of Indigenous people was central to the new Wild West show. The other elements in Buffalo Bill's Wild West were borrowed from an emerging type of ranch country entertainment that was associated with biannual cattle roundups. These were essentially agricultural fairs that started featuring demonstrations of cowboy skills. We're talking herding, roping and wrestling steers, bronco busting, the kind of things that would eventually become rodeo events. In the late 1870s, Buffalo Bill bought a large ranch in North Platte, Nebraska. This was where he first encountered the Roundup exhibitions, which he later incorporated into his Wild West show as cowboy fun. North Platte also offered a good environment to test drive his new arena-sized Wild West show. The earliest iterations of the show were very much like a Western-themed circus. It was filled with horse races, death-defying stunts, tons of gunplay, and simulated buffalo hunts. By 1883, the show was on its feet and drawing crowds. But like most circuses, the Wild West was not really considered respectable entertainment. Now, one upshot of creating a more circus-like show was that the critics tended to be less harsh and discerning when compared to theater critics, who routinely eviscerated Bill's melodramas. Circuses were seen as a less serious diversion, and as such, the press coverage tended to be softer. Papers would sometimes even print copy provided by circus promoters without comment. Bill seems to have appreciated this more genial coverage. But the early show was so raucous and circus-like that it had a reputation for drawing a disreputable crowd, which in 19th century speak meant lower class and mostly male. By 1884, Bill had partnered with a promoter named Nate Salisbury, who helped Buffalo Bill hone the show into something that could appeal to middle-class families. This meant toning down some of the more dangerous or violent elements and leaning into the parts of the show that were allegedly educational. This shifted the show's emphasis towards its historical reenactments. The circus feats needed to seem incidental to a bigger story about America and the manly struggle to tame the continental expanse. It took a few seasons for the show to settle in, but by 1885, the Wild West had more or less found its structure. So, allow me to take you through the Wild West show. The program started off with a grand parade featuring all of the Wild West performers. This was something like the opening ceremony of the Olympics. Bands played and outmarched the cowboys, the indigenous performers, the horses, the bison, the elk, colorful flags, everyone in their most elaborate costumes, making circuits of the arena and getting the crowd hyped. The audience was then given a formal introduction from their master of ceremonies, the legendary Buffalo Bill himself. This was then usually followed by a bareback pony race, exclusively featuring the show's indigenous performers. Then came the demonstration of the Pony Express, with riders showcasing lightning-fast transfers from one horse to the next and death-defying retrievals of mailbags. This was the first quasi-historical reenactment. But in this case, the Pony Express was basically being used as a loose premise for a trick riding act. As we spoke about in the last episode, the Pony Express only existed for a short 18 months. It is true that the riders became famous for making long rides at impressive speeds, but the trick riding on display in Buffalo Bill's show really had nothing to do with the Pony Express reality. The audience was also regaled with stories about Buffalo Bill's feats as the service's youngest rider. Now, in terms of propagating fake history, this act was not particularly egregious. At worst, it simply gave the impression that the Pony Express was far more important than it actually was. The next act was a little less innocent. After the Pony Express demonstration came one of the show's more elaborate reenactments. This was the attack on the Deadwood Stagecoach. The Deadwood Stagecoach was a large treasure coach painted golden yellow. Bill claimed that he had found the glorious old coach abandoned while on a scouting expedition in the Black Hills of South Dakota. He then purchased the coach from the Cheyenne Black Hills Stagecoach Company and had it moved back east. He claimed that the vehicle had been left at the side of the trail because it had been involved in a famous stagecoach robbery while it was transporting mail and gold from Wyoming to Deadwood, South Dakota. Now, it was true that in 1877, a stagecoach working that route was violently robbed. The attack on the coach left the young driver, John Slaughter, dead. Slaughter was the son of a well-known judge in the area, which made the incident particularly notorious. Now, was the coach that Bill wheeled out into the arena that same coach that John Slaughter rode on that fateful day? Definitely not. Biographers have since discovered that Bill ordered a brand new stagecoach from South Dakota specifically for use in the show. Not only was this not the stagecoach from the famous holdup, this coach had never even been used by the company. It was commissioned for the stage. But more significantly, the attack presented in the Wild West show had very little to do with the real robbery that occurred in 1877. The 1877 robbery is usually credited to a group of Anglo-American outlaws known as the Sam Bass Gang. The shooter was likely a red-haired army deserter known as Reddy McKinney. But in Buffalo Bill's hands, this event was transformed into something very different. In the Wild West show, the Deadwood Stagecoach entered the arena and promenaded around so the crowd could get a good look at what they were told was a historical artifact. Then the attackers burst onto the scene. But this was not some facsimile of the Sam Bass Gang. This was a group of indigenous warriors in full feathered war regalia. The whooping warriors surrounded the coach and started firing arrows and the occasional round from a rifle. Then, when all looked lost, Buffalo Bill and his crew of cowboys would arrive on the scene, driving off the attackers and saving the day. Now, where do we even start with this? First, let's just dismiss the preposterous idea that Buffalo Bill rode in and stopped the 1877 Deadwood stagecoach robbery. That is pure fiction, and one more bald-faced example of Bill absorbing a Western icon into his personal mythology. The stagecoach was an emblem of the West, a mode of transportation that was associated with being at the vanguard of progressing civilization. By the 1880s, the stagecoaches were also starting to fade away as the railway was beginning to fill the gaps. So, of course, Bill told his audience that he owned the most famous stagecoach in the West. And even better, he had personally saved the most famous stagecoach from a robbery. Buffalo Blob strikes again. But more serious was Bill's choice to change the attackers into indigenous people. By making this change, he completely changed the meaning of the Deadwood stagecoach robbery. The indigenous attackers are presented as greedy, bloodthirsty, and standing in the way of American progress, as represented by the stagecoach. Bill and the show's other creators purposefully misrepresented history in this instance to help support a larger narrative that they were trying to create with the show. The West was once dangerous and ruled by lawless savages, but it had been tamed by the likes of Buffalo Bill and his Anglo-Saxon cowboys. Now, it's very telling that to illustrate that specific narrative, Buffalo Bill had to invent fictional scenes and pass them off as real historical events. The truth was that stagecoach robberies were almost always carried out by settler gangs, like the Sam Bass Gang. Indigenous attacks on treasure coaches were so rare, in fact, that Bill didn't even know of a real one that he could depict in his show. The entrance of the cowboy posse during the Deadwood stagecoach attack acted as the introduction to the cowboy section of the show. The middle section of the Wild West show was mostly composed of what Buffalo Bill called cowboy fun. This included roping demonstrations, bronco riding, and trick shooting acts. Now, originally, the shooters were Bill himself and a champion trap shooter named A.H. Bogardus. But in the show's third season, Bill brought on a new shooting act that would become one of the Wild West's biggest draws. This was the 25-year-old sharpshooter named Annie Oakley, along with her husband, Frank Butler. Annie's shooting act was truly next level. She could shoot a cigarette from her husband's lips, split a playing card edge on. She could hit dimes in midair and shoot targets behind her back using a mirror. Not only was she a crack shot, she was also a bit of an acrobat. Standing less than 5 feet tall, Annie was incredibly quick and would perform feats of agility while knocking targets out of the air. Some, like biographer Lewis Warren, have credited Annie Oakley with helping the Wild West show find its much-coveted middle-class family audience. The fact that Annie was a married woman who performed her act with her husband brought an air of domesticity to what was otherwise a fairly violent act. Having men like Bill and A.H. Bogardus perform feats of gunplay doubled down on the violence in what was an already violent show. But the fact that their trick shooter was a woman was perceived as not only novel, but as more suitable for female audiences and children. In this way, the gun act, which could have come across as the most intense and violent part of the show, instead read as the most wholesome and family-friendly part of the program. After Annie Oakley and the cowboy fun, usually came the simulated buffalo hunt, featuring real bison running around the arena. Then came the final historical scene. Now, this scene changed a few times over the course of the Wild West's 30-year run. But at first, the grand finale was an attack on a settler cabin. For this scene, a small cabin would be quickly built in the middle of the arena. The scene begins with a family of settlers welcoming home their father who had been hunting for the day. But shockingly, they discover that the man was followed home by a fierce Lakota warrior. The hunter would then shoot the warrior from his horse, but soon it becomes clear that he was just a scout. Then into the arena would charge a band of mounted indigenous warriors who proceed to lay siege to the log cabin while the family of settlers discharged rifles from the windows. The log cabin would then be set on fire by the attackers, and things would look dire until, you guessed it, Buffalo Bill and a posse of cowboys would come riding in, guns blazing. The native warriors would be dispersed, and the family saved. Now, once again, we have a supposedly historical scene that did not actually depict any one real event. But it was presented like the kind of thing that happened all the time on the frontier. A group of peaceful settlers suffer an entirely unprovoked attack by indigenous people who want them dead for some unknown reason. The narrative here is almost identical to what was presented during the stagecoach robbery scene. Native people are presented as villains who are violent by nature, and in this case have no qualms targeting women and children. Violence in the Wild West show was almost always instigated by the indigenous characters. Settlers wielded weapons always in self-defense to protect their hard-won gains, be it the treasures of the stagecoach or the family home. Now, there might be some of you thinking, well, what's the big deal? This was just a show. And that's very true. But this was a show that presented itself as historical education. The Wild West was supposedly an authentic representation of Western life. Audiences were being encouraged to believe that all of these scenes were rooted in real, lived experiences. The deep narratives about who was good and who was evil in the American West played to established prejudices and reinforced them. The show also helped enhance Bill's own mythological reputation, although some remained skeptical. As Bill biographer Lewis Warren writes, quote, "The seam between truth and fiction, fake exploits and real deeds was so artfully sewn as to be all but invisible. In a sense, Buffalo Bill was an inversion of a Barnum exhibit, the stitching of his deception culminating not in some freakish monkey fish or ape man, but a consummate American man who embodied the progressive mythology of the frontier. Audiences could pick and choose what they were willing to believe, and some were never convinced that Cody was everything he claimed to be. The New York Dramatic News referred to Cody as Bluffer Blow Bill." End quote. Bluffer Blow Bill. Nice. I like the idea of Bill as the inverse of a cheap P.T. Barnum prank. His deception was more effective because the final reveal was a myth that his audience wanted to believe. This was the idea that rugged Anglo-Saxon manhood had brought civilization to the West in the face of impossible odds. Now, one thing that might seem quite puzzling is why so many indigenous performers agreed to be part of the Wild West show. Why would someone participate in a program where their people were being vilified and their deaths celebrated? Well, the answer is kind of complicated. So let's take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll try and pick it apart. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Rosetta Stone. The holidays are coming up, and there's nothing more meaningful than learning something new. Whether you want to reconnect with family roots, prep for an upcoming trip, or give someone a gift that actually lasts, Rosetta Stone is the perfect way to start something special. Rosetta Stone has been the trusted leader in language learning for over 30 years. Their immersive, intuitive method helps you truly pick up your new language naturally. No memorizing random vocabulary lists, no feeling lost. As many of you know, I have been on a quest to improve my French. My oldest kid is currently in French immersion, and I've had to do my best to keep up. Well, Rosetta Stone has really helped with the process. With Rosetta Stone, you can learn anytime, anywhere. It fits your lifestyle with flexible, on-the-go learning. You can access lessons from your desktop or your mobile app, whether you have 5 minutes or an hour. So don't wait. Unlock your language learning potential now. Our Fake History listeners can grab Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. That's unlimited access to 25 language courses for life. Visit rosettastone.com/history to get started and claim your 50% off today. Give a gift that keeps on giving. Go to rosettastone.com/history and start learning today. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Rula. Taking care of your mental health shouldn't be harder than taking care of your physical health. If you pull a muscle, go see a doctor. But when it comes to finding the right therapist, suddenly it's frustrating. You've got long wait lists, or you're staring down a huge out-of-pocket cost. That's what usually stops people from getting help. That's where Rula comes in. Rula makes therapy simple, affordable, and fast. They work with most major insurance plans, and the average session copay is just $15. $15. That's basically the cost of lunch, but instead of a sandwich, you're investing in your own headspace. Getting started couldn't be easier. You answer a few quick questions about what matters to you, and Rula connects you with in-network providers who actually fit your needs. You pick the time, and you could be talking to a therapist as soon as the next day. No weeks of waiting, no endless back and forth. Thousands of people have already used Rula to finally get the care they need. Don't keep putting it off. Go to rula.com/fakehistory and get started today. That's RULA.com/fakehistory. Take the first step. Get connected and take control of your mental health. By 1885, the Wild West firmly established itself as one of America's most popular touring shows. Annie Oakley was becoming a celebrity in her own right, and her inclusion in the show helped the Wild West court the highly desirable middle-class family audience. That year, the show was also joined by one of the most consequential indigenous leaders of the era, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader, Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull had been one of the most important Lakota leaders during the Black Hills War, and had played a key role in the Lakota victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But after a 4-year exile in Canada, Sitting Bull and his followers were forced to return to the United States and surrender to the U.S. government. His Hunkpapa Lakota were resettled in the reservation lands of the Standing Rock Agency. Once there, Sitting Bull became the purview of U.S. government Indian officials. The chief soon realized that one of the few ways he could bring in money for his struggling people was as a performer. Audiences were eager to see the man who was perceived as one of the last great Plains warriors. To this end, the Indian Agency permitted him to undertake small tours. This caught the attention of Bill Cody, who petitioned the Indian Agency to allow him to bring Sitting Bull on his 1885 Wild West tour through the United States and Canada. After some cajoling, permission was granted, and Sitting Bull was paid to join the Wild West show. Wild West show experts like L.G. Moses believe that Sitting Bull's presence on the 1885 tour was instrumental in making the Wild West an enduring success. Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull also seemed to have a good working relationship. The men would eventually become quite friendly. Not only was Sitting Bull well paid by Buffalo Bill, he was also able to make extra money by selling autographed pictures after the show. Now, I found that little detail particularly mind-blowing because during the Black Hills War, Sitting Bull had been vilified as an enemy of the United States. Just a few years later, he was celebrated as a type of celebrity. Interestingly, Sitting Bull was granted a certain level of dignity as a performer in the Wild West show. He was not expected to take part in any of the reenactments or be involved in any of the violent scenes. He was part of the introductory parade and was very much able to shape how he was presented in the show. He was not there to be some loathsome Plains villain. He was a respected Hunk Papa chief, and that is how he was presented. Sitting Bull only stayed with the show for about 1 year, but in that time, he not only raised the profile of the Wild West, he also helped set a new template for how Indigenous people could participate in the show. You see, one of the ironies of the Wild West show was that it was one of the few places where Indigenous culture and horsecraft could be expressed in the 1880s. At the time, the policy of the American Indian Agency was one of forcible assimilation. Traditional cultures, languages, and religions were being actively suppressed in an effort to have Indigenous people accept the religion, language, and farming practices of Anglo-America. While the Indian Agency was intentionally trying to eradicate Indigenous cultural practices, the Wild West show offered an opportunity to keep those practices alive. Buffalo Bill's Wild West also offered autonomy and financial freedom to its Indigenous performers. The Lakota and Pawnee people who joined Buffalo Bill were some of the few who were able to leave their reservations. These folks were able to travel freely and were paid reasonably. Now, of course, this was a devil's bargain. These performers secured for themselves decent jobs and a level of autonomy and freedom denied many of their people, but they were limited in how they could perform. As we've already seen, the show dealt in crude stereotypes, and the performers were either cast as noble savages or as violent enemies of civilization. And yet, many Indigenous people found life with the show preferable to existence on the reservation. It was also one of the few ways that they could bring money back to their families on those reservations. Buffalo Bill's representations of Native people also evolved over time. As the show went on, he leaned more into the noble savage tropes. One of the show's most ambitious historical recreations was surprisingly reasonable when it came to how it depicted the Lakota. Starting in 1886, the Wild West show started using a grand reenactment of the Battle of Little Bighorn as the show's climax. As I mentioned in the last episode, the Battle of Little Bighorn was one of the most decisive victories for the Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne during the Black Hills War. But soon after the battle, it very quickly became a thing of myth. The slain American Army commander, George Armstrong Custer, was made into a bit of a martyr. Thanks to Buffalo Bill and the Wild West show, and his many imitators, between 1886 and the turn of the century, the Battle of Little Bighorn became the most reenacted event from all of American history. To really add to the drama, Buffalo Bill commissioned a giant landscape painting that covered the entire end of the arena. This painting had a special entranceway that horses could ride through. It was painted in a way to give the illusion that anyone coming out of the entrance was riding in from a great distance over the plain. Buffalo Bill dubbed this historical reenactment Custer's Last Rally. While the reenactment certainly valorized the American cavalry commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, it also made it clear that the American cavalry started the fight that day. In the reenactment, a bugle would sound and the U.S. cavalry would charge towards a Lakota village. But Custer would soon realize he was outnumbered. Dozens of Lakota riders would emerge from the giant landscape painting and surround the U.S. cavalrymen. Custer was then given a very dramatic death. Then, as the scene cleared, Buffalo Bill would ride into the arena and 2 words would be projected onto the giant painting. Too late. Now, that last little moment was a fairly ridiculous addition. Buffalo Bill was suggesting that he was at the Battle of Little Bighorn and had arrived just a moment too late to save Custer. We know that Buffalo Bill was actually over 150 miles away from Little Bighorn that day. Nevertheless, in a performance that largely depicted Indigenous warriors dealing out unprovoked violence against settlers, the show's depiction of Little Bighorn was surprisingly even-handed. Little Bighorn was sometimes depicted as a massacre motivated by quote-unquote Lakota savagery. Buffalo Bill's reenactment thankfully defied that mischaracterization. This was because, despite everything, Bill was fairly sympathetic to the Lakota. The year he started performing the Battle of Little Bighorn as part of the Wild West show, he told a reporter, quote, "The defeat of Custer was not a massacre. The Indians were being pursued by skilled fighters with orders to kill. For centuries, they had been hounded. They had their wives and little ones to protect, and they were fighting for their existence. 9 times out of 10, when there is trouble between white men and Indians, it will be found that the white man is responsible." End quote. Now, this is a remarkable quote, given the narratives that coursed through the Wild West show. In the show, very rarely were the white performers cast as the instigators of violence. And yet, as the 1880s wore on, Buffalo Bill, who once promoted himself as the West's premier Indian fighter, started speaking passionately about the plight of Indigenous people. In fact, he became one of the most high-profile advocates for the rights of Indigenous people at that time. Even the Lakota activist and scholar Vina Deloria Jr., who I quoted in the last episode calling Custer the Eichmann of the Plains, had this to say about Buffalo Bill. Quote, "Buffalo Bill's relationship with the Indians, absent the aura of show business, seemed above average in the positive human qualities of justice and fair play." End quote. We know that Mr. Deloria Jr. does not pull his punches, so that assessment is worth noting. The Indigenous performers who worked as part of the Wild West seem to have appreciated Bill, and Bill seems to have developed a deeper understanding of his Indigenous performers. All of this is to say that Buffalo's relationship with and presentation of Indigenous people was complicated. Sometimes it was very ugly, but not always. I'll let you make of that what you will. After a half-decade touring the United States and Canada, including a successful winter stint at Madison Square Garden, there was no denying that the Wild West was a bona fide hit. It was also on the road to being perceived as something grander and more dignified than a circus. But the show ascended to a new level of cultural relevance in 1887, when Buffalo Bill loaded his massive crew of animals and entertainers onto a steamer and took them across the Atlantic for his first ever tour of the United Kingdom. This included a legendary 5-month stand in London. At first, this was seen as a gamble, as it was deeply unclear how English audiences would respond to this deeply American show. But it turned out to be an unqualified triumph. In fact, London was seized with a kind of Wild West mania. This was helped enormously by the interest paid by the British royal family. The biggest royal fan of the Wild West was Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. Edward was treated to an advanced performance of the Wild West a week before the show's opening. He loved it so much that he encouraged his mother, Queen Victoria, to command a private showing of the Wild West for her and a large entourage of royals, politicians, and British celebrities. This show for Queen Victoria would end up giving birth to a few historical myths. First, you will sometimes see reported that the 1887 Wild West show was the first time Queen Victoria attended any type of public entertainment in over 25 years. Now, it is true that after the death of Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, she went into a period of deep mourning. She wore black almost exclusively for decades, and she very rarely left her royal residences. Her public appearances were incredibly rare. But it's not true that the Wild West show was the first thing that got her out of the house in over 2 decades. 1887 was the Queen's Jubilee year, which was part of the reason why Bill had chosen that moment to take his arena show across the pond. This meant that in 1887, Queen Victoria had been compelled to attend a number of public events. Now, it is true that Victoria refused to go to the theater until the 1890s, but she was a noted lover of the circus. Records show that just a few months before Bill arrived, Queen Victoria had been out to see a French circus that happened to be on tour from the Paris Hippodrome. Queen Victoria did get out occasionally, and it was usually to see circuses. But, of course, the story that played better back in the United States was that the first thing to rouse the Queen after decades of mourning was the Wild West. The other story that was eagerly reported stateside was a remarkable event that allegedly occurred during the Wild West's opening ceremonies. As part of the opening parade, a cowboy on horseback presented an unfurled American flag to the Queen. One of Buffalo Bill's publicists, a man by the name of Arizona John Burke, described the event like this, quote, "As the standard-bearer waved the proud emblem above his head, Her Majesty rose from her seat and bowed deeply and impressively toward the banner. For the first time since the Declaration of Independence, a sovereign of Great Britain had saluted the Star-Spangled Banner, and that banner was carried by a member of Buffalo Bill's Wild West." End quote. Now, did Queen Victoria actually bow to the American flag? Well, probably not. When you compare John Burke's account to those found in English publications, it seems like he was probably exaggerating. First, we should all just recognize that it would be a huge breach of protocol for a British royal to bow to the flag of a foreign nation while in England. This sort of thing just did not happen. If it had happened, it would have caused a scandal in England, and this scandal did not materialize. According to the English reports, the American flag was indeed presented to Queen Victoria, and the flag was dipped as a salute in front of the Queen, as was customary. The Queen then responded by acknowledging the dip of the flag with a nod of her head. Now, this account makes way more sense because it's in keeping with proper flag etiquette. Flags dip in front of the Queen, and she nods. That's how it goes. But of course, back in the US, it was reported that Buffalo Bill had not only won the hearts of the Brits, he had pulled off a diplomatic coup by having the flag venerated by a British monarch. Now, part of the reason this story seems to have been believed by some was because it communicated a bigger truth about Bill's sojourn across the Atlantic. He had won a new level of respect for American entertainment that had previously been denied by European audiences. Queen Victoria's patronage of the show and the Prince of Wales' vocal enthusiasm helped make the London run of the Wild West show a huge success. The prince even returned to the show for an encore performance, bringing with him the King of Denmark, the King of Greece, and the King and Queen of the Belgians. The prince even had a ride in the Deadwood stagecoach. Londoners flocked to the show by the thousands. For a moment in the summer of 1887, cowboy hats became a trendy fashion accessory on the streets of London. News of this in the United States was met with both amazement and a certain level of pride. In the 1880s, many Americans were desirous of European respect. There were some who were openly resentful of the fact that many Europeans still seemed to look down their noses at American culture. It was no small thing that an American act had so thoroughly broken through in the UK. However, there were some American observers that were a little dismayed by the fact that a circus show built around frontier stereotypes was the American product finally deemed acceptable by British audiences. But perhaps this was to be expected. The Wild West show played to European prejudices about Americans. They often didn't like it when Americans played at being artistically sophisticated. This was incongruous with the prevalent stereotype that Americans were boorish, barbarous colonials. The Wild West show, on the other hand, presented Americans in all their barbarous glory. It confirmed a European prejudice that Americans were less civilized, but countered it with the idea that this lack of civilization made Americans especially virile, brave, and purposeful. Buffalo Bill and his whole band were noble savages, not just the indigenous performers. This was a vision of America that British audiences could get on board with. An anonymous poem made the rounds in American papers, pointing out the irony in all of this. It went, quote, "Our plays put the Londoners all in a rage. They howled our comedians off of the stage. Our daintiest actresses met with a groan. They let our tragedians severely alone. But art is triumphant. The city so vast bows down to American genius at last." End quote. In the estimation of the anonymous author, real American theater had been snubbed in favor of a cheesy cowboy show. The poem was both a jab at the British and Buffalo Bill. Could the British really be so sophisticated if they thought the Wild West show was some sort of cultural experience? But this poem reflected the attitude of the same East Coast theater critics who had always had a distaste for the crudities of old Bluffer Blow Bill. For the most part, Bill's fellow Americans were proud of his breakthrough across the pond. When Bill returned from his first tour of the UK, he found himself the toast of New York City. Buffalo Bill now entered the final phase of his journey. As Thomas Jefferson had predicted, the American journey ended with the refinement of the seaport towns. After the 1887 season in the UK, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was now recognized as a great piece of American entertainment. Bill himself transitioned into the life of a New York socialite. While he kept a ranch in Nebraska, Bill fully started living the life of a big city entertainment mogul. Once the Wild West show had been fully validated by its European run, it never really lost popularity for the next 20 years. The show would tour the UK and continental Europe 7 times between 1892 and 1906. Back in the United States, it remained a perennial draw. During the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, or the World Columbian Exposition as it was known, the Wild West set up shop just outside of the official fairgrounds. Apparently, during the summer of 1893, something like 18,000 people attended the Wild West performance daily. The poignancy of the show was underscored by lectures by the historian Frederick Turner, who, in a nearby hall, reflected on the end of the American frontier. It was going, folks, so you better catch it now at the Wild West show. The show remained incredibly popular through the turn of the century. However, when Annie Oakley departed in late 1901, it marked a turning point for the Wild West. The show would continue on for another solid decade, but its presence in the culture steadily started to decline. Bill's competitors caught up with him. Local rodeos were now providing many of the same thrills that at one time had been exclusive to Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Soon, moving pictures would pick up on many of the cowboys and Indian tropes that Bill had established, and it would repackage them for a whole new generation. Now, you would think that this amazing success meant that Buffalo Bill Cody became a very rich man. Well, despite coming into some serious windfalls throughout his life, Bill was never particularly good with money. He was a lavish spender, and he also had a penchant for making foolhardy investments in ill-fated business ventures. He lost just as much money as he took in, which is one of the reasons Bill stayed on the road with the Wild West well past the age when many others would have retired. Bill also made his way through a series of business partners. Now, most of these men appreciated the enduring appeal of the Wild West. However, not all of them appreciated that one of the show's secret weapons was its aspirations towards historical gravitas. In the later years of the show, Bill was inclined to work with various circus promoters who, predictably, made the Wild West into a bit more of a circus. By 1913, Bill's financial mismanagement meant that the Wild West's many debtors had the exhibition sold at auction. It continued on under the auspices of the Sells Floto Circus until 1916, with Bill staying on as a performer. Throughout all of it, William Cody remained stubbornly committed to playing the part of Buffalo Bill in the arena. His last show was in November 1916. He died in Colorado just 3 months later. The 30-year run of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was nothing short of astounding. Part of the lasting power of the show was that as the years went on, the message of the Wild West became all the more poignant. The idea that animated this unique exhibition had always been that the West was disappearing. Every year, this imagined frontier was getting further and further away. The way of life being depicted in the Wild West show, however exaggerated or invented, was going away. And only through the gymnastic feats of these dedicated preservationists could one still experience it. As Bill aged in the arena, this idea was imbued with even more pathos and drama. Soon, the West would be gone, and so too would this dignified old scout. But this experience was an illusion. It had always been an illusion. The fact that Buffalo Bill claimed to be showing you something that was constantly disappearing made him a hard guy to fact-check. If you went to the West and found things not as Buffalo Bill had described, well, that's because you had just missed it. The West of his show must have already faded away before you got there. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when I will be answering any questions that you may have about this series on Buffalo Bill in a bonus episode. Yes, because of the holidays, I'm taking a very short break, but the shows keep coming, and on December 30th, you can expect a bonus episode where I will be answering questions. So, if you've got questions for me, please send them to ourfakehistory@gmail.com. If you are a patron, then please drop your questions in the chat about this particular episode. While I've got you here, I just want to remind everyone that we are going to Greece in 2026. We are still trying to fill a few spots on this trip, so if you are interested, then please book today. Remember, we are going to Athens, we are going to Crete, we are going to Santorini. We're going to check out all the historical sites. We're going to go to museums. We're going to go sailing. It's going to be awesome. So, if you're interested, go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links for the trip, or go to johnshorestravel.com and look up next year's trip to Greece. If you book, don't forget to use the promo code OFH so they know that I sent you. Before we go this week, as always, I need to give some very special shout-outs. Big ups to Philip Smith, to Hillary, to Karlovs Minor, to Justin Driscoll, to Philip Haberstroh, to Kate Schupfle, to Remington Eckhart, ooh, good name, to Margarita, and to Brian West. All of these folks have decided to pledge $5 or more on Patreon every month. So you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. Thank you for voting in our most recent poll. And I hope you enjoy the upcoming extra episode, which will be on the 7 wonders of the ancient world. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with me, send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. Find me on Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. Find me on YouTube at ourfakehistory. I am everywhere, people. You can find me on all the social media. You can also buy merch. We're talking t-shirts, tote bags, hoodies, and more at our TeePublic store. Just go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links for the store, or go to teepublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. As always, the theme music for the show today comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
free with all the best movies. The holidays are brutal,
so if you're feeling frugal,
stream Pluto TV, stream Pluto TV, stream Pluto TV for free.
Stream blockbuster hits like 21 Jump Street, Ted, The Expendables, and so much more on Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.